Dylan Chatterton. How important is the way to happiness to a full-time Scientologist going up the bridge? Is it a requirement at any point in Scientology? I've always been quite intrigued by this book because it reads nothing like your typical Scientology material written by Hubbard. Did he actually write it? Was the initial intended purpose of it to be used as a gateway into the org as it's used now in Scientology's front groups? Thanks for this question, Dylan. It's a very good one. And The Way to Happiness has a kind of interesting backstory to it. For those of you who don't know, The Way to Happiness is Scientology's secular, non-religious moral code. It's L. Ron Hubbard had the guts and balls to actually very hypocritically sit down and write I believe it's 21 or 24 precepts that make up this moral code called The Way to Happiness. And Hubbard asserts in this pamphlet-sized book, which is also printed as a hardcover book, but it's a pretty short read. And it just kind of breaks down these 24, 21, like I said, I didn't even look it up, number of precepts. And then there's little sub-precepts under them. For example, there's take good care of yourself. And then under that you have, take good care of your teeth, shower, keep your body clean, eat right. So that would all be under that precept of take care of yourself. And then there's do not murder, which is pretty clear. Doesn't need a whole lot of sub precepts under it. It's just don't murder people. Don't steal. Don't hurt a person of good intent. Support and love your parents. Support a government established for and run by and for the people. These kind of pro-Western values, pro-democracy kind of moral code. And it would not be universally applicable or appealing to the world at large, but Scientology throws it out there as a way to try to get people on some common ground. And it is definitely aligned around principles that most people in Western societies especially would immediately agree with, and quite a few in Eastern societies, and Middle East even. It's been passed out there. It's been given out, and to whatever result, good, bad, sideways, it's been given out all over the world. There's been millions and millions and millions of these things printed, and we'll get to that. So Hubbard created this book. He wrote this book back in, I believe it was 1980. That's why I think that's when it was published. And this was a direct response. This was done in response to and as part of the overall PR handling, the public relations, damage control that Scientology had to engage in the late 1970s and early 80s in order to try to push back against the horribly bad public perception that they had at that point following the 1977 FBI raid on the Los Angeles base and raids that were done, I believe, up in Canada as well, where the whole Operation Snow White thing kind of was exposed and fell apart. And I'm not going to go into all the detail on that. It's totally ancillary to it's just backstory for The Way to Happiness. But if you're curious, excuse me, there are. I think there's a whole Wikipedia page on Operation Snow White, which you can look up. It was quite an extensive operation. It was an covert intelligence operation Scientology ran on the U.S. and other governments around the world, infiltrated them, stole things. So they got busted. They got busted really hard, and it was front page news, and it was a big deal. And Scientology's name was Mud. And L. Ron Hubbard was in a lot of trouble. He was an unindicted co-conspirator, along with 11 other Scientologists, including his wife. And while Hubbard was never officially indicted, his wife and those other Scientologists were. And they went to jail. And like I said, L. Ron Hubbard had a real public relations disaster nightmare on his hands with this. All of his own making. L. Ron Hubbard was the one who originated and enforced and ran this whole operation. So that's why I say it was quite ballsy and hypocritical of him to then turn around and present a moral code, a code of conduct of how to live a life of honesty and virtue and integrity to the world at large when he was one of the biggest criminals ever. Okay, so that's what The Way to Happiness is. And you asked how important is it to people going up the bridge? Well, truthfully, not very. Scientologists almost uniformly agree with, read, like The Way to Happiness. There's very few things about it to not like. It's very general. It was designed to appeal to the most number of people possible. That was the point, was to get Scientology's name out of the mud by showing that it is something that is good and positions itself with integrity and honesty, and this is who we are. This whole thing that all these people going to jail and all this was just a government setup. We didn't do any of that. We're good people, right? We're the best people. In fact, Hubbard has written that Scientologists are the most ethical people on the planet. And I don't just point that out for the hypocrisy value, but to make the point that Scientologists are indoctrinated by Hubbard, even without The Way to Happiness, that they are the most ethical people just because they're Scientologists. It's a status thing. See, status or a label isn't what makes you a virtuous or good person. It's just a word that somebody connects with you. Whether that word is suppressive person or whether that person is, or that word is saint, it doesn't matter. Those are just stupid labels. It's what you do. But PR is all about imagery and it's about association. And so Hubbard knew this. And it was a constant refrain. It was a constant strategy, rather, for him through the years of Scientology. And it was a successful strategy for him to position Scientology, Dianetics, Scientology, and his whole activity as being ethical, moral, righteous, workable, scientific, philosophical, truth, right? Save the world kind of thing. Like, all of these things are what Hubbard was constantly positioning Scientology as. And he was constantly positioning the enemy, like psychiatry, as evil, horrible, murderous, authoritarian. Like, everything that Scientology is, Hubbard said his enemies were. He was purposefully reversing the image, you could say, right? He was purposely, like, sort of casting all of their characteristics over there. It was one big misdirector, basically, and that's the PR end of it. Well, The Way to Happiness was a continuation of that kind of strategy, right? Here we are, totally busted, totally our asses out in the wind. People are going to jail, including L. Ron Hubbard's own wife. And what does he do? He responds with his usual PR strategy of, well, let's position the government as the bad guys and we're the good guys. Because look, here's a moral code. Would a bad person write this? Would a horrible person be capable of thinking and promoting and writing virtuous precepts that everybody should follow? Right? Like, it's this kind of thinking. It's very shallow. I mean, but unfortunately, in the PR world, it works. Now, it didn't work like gangbusters with Scientology, but it has been, over the years, a great vehicle for Scientology to use to create inroads as a front group activity around the world, because no one can really argue very vehemently against The Way to Happiness unless you know all this backstory. And then you can just call out the hypocrisy of it. But even then, the purity of just the book, The Way to Happiness, there really isn't a whole lot wrong with it. It's not necessarily going to achieve happiness, but don't murder, don't steal, respect your parents. These are not. There's nothing wrong with any of that. There's no little weird curves. I mean, there's a couple little Scientological, little bits and pieces here and there, but for the most part, there's really nothing wrong with it. Okay, now, there is only one point on the bridge for Scientologists where they are going to have to pay attention to this book. Otherwise, you could do Scientology and never really pay attention to, even have to read, or have much to do with The Way to Happiness, except for this one service, and it is called the happiness rundown. And it's pretty low on the bridge. It's one of the first things that you could do. Not everybody is directed to do it. It's one of these sort of optional rundowns that a case supervisor can say, well, this person's going to need it and this other person's not going to need it. I think the deciding factor on this was something I wasn't even super familiar with. I think I saw a handful of these delivered over the years that I was in, because it wasn't a very popular rundown while I was in, and it was not on the bridge until the later years of Scientology. Miscavige revised the grade chart, and that's when it reappeared on there. It was first developed when the book came out back in 1980, 1981. And it was a series of questions and commands that were given to Scientologists as a rundown. So it would be an ongoing series of sessions. It wouldn't just be 1 or 2 sessions. It would be an extensive action. It would probably take around 25 to 50 hours of auditing to get through. And it involves false data stripping and other work using the Way to Happiness book, precept by precept, to not only recall times that you have violated these precepts or times you followed the precepts, so you get the plus and the minus, right? But you also look for and eradicate or try to remove false information the person might have received over the years about these different precepts, various justifications and reasons why it's okay to not take care of yourself, not honor your parents, this kind of stuff. So it's, in standard Hubbard fashion, it was about, okay, well, have you violated it? How have you screwed it up? How have you been a bad boy with this? And let's get all that documented and looked over. And then maybe that will sort of, pop any tendencies or urges you might have to continue to be an immoral person. It's kind of what the point of the rundown is. And that's why it's kind of low on the bridge. And it's, again, nothing particularly super objectionable there. It's kind of lightweight auditing as far as that goes. It's not like the OT levels or something like that, where it's more heavy duty and psychologically kind of damaging. But it's not something that I would ever recommend somebody do. As I've said many, many times, I don't endorse any part of this crap. Because it's part of an authoritarian structure and system and a snitch culture and all kinds of other things that you just don't want to have anything to do with. As far as the rundown itself goes, the actions that are done are all relative, because morality, let's face it, is relative. And I know that's a big argument in the apologetics world, but it is. We all have our own ideas of what's right, wrong, good, or bad. And there is no objective moral authority. There are people who pretend to be. And there's an idea that God sort of is, but last time I checked, God didn't tell me what to do as far as right or wrong. I figure that out for myself. So that's, so morality and ethics and good conduct and all that, these are fairly controversial topics for some people, and they can be difficult for others. So an examination, a review, some counseling on the topic, something like that wouldn't necessarily be horrible. But the Way to Happiness isn't the way to go, because you're really only going to kind of go in on that action with the way Scientology processes run. And the false data stripping I mentioned is one kind of action that's done. It's not auditing, but it's kind of a memory kind of action where you're going to recall times in the past where people have given you information that you now believe or take to be false. But you could be wrong. I mean, I had all kinds of information in my head that was stripped out of me with false data stripping when I was in Scientology that were actually completely true pieces of information about science, about physics, about anatomy, about, kind of real world sciencey stuff that Hubbard didn't agree with or Scientology didn't agree with. And so, that's what I mean by the false data stripping being kind of relative. And, the false and what you're going to pull is going to be kind of relative. And you can use a tool like that to reinforce immoral or bad thinking as much as you could use it to pop or release ideas that might keep immoral behavior in place. It can go either way, you see. So this is why it's a little risky getting into something like that, and why I would never endorse it. Okay, so just to kind of really explain the brass tacks of why that might not be a good thing to do. So I think most Scientologists, are doing that rundown now as part of their journey up the bridge. But it is far from the most significant thing that that Scientologists do. It's sort of a minor rundown, really, in the big scheme of things. And clearly, just to make the point, clearly we can see that doing this rundown doesn't make a person a better person if in the world of Scientology, because people who do this rundown still support disconnection, still support covering up all the crimes and abuse of Scientology, and are still on the side of a destructive authoritarian cult. So, how effective is that rundown really? Not very. Okay. You asked, about the front groups. It's definitely part of the front group activity of Scientology. There is now a foundation called the Way to Happiness Foundation. I think it's in Burbank or Glendale in California. And they produce custom-made Way to Happiness booklets, print on demand style, with custom covers. So you can get your own cover on there. It'll still say the Way to Happiness and L. Ron Hubbard's name, but the symbolism or the imagery on the cover might be your company. And you might have and they solicit for companies to do sponsorships of printing lots of copies of these and then passing them out at public events, sporting events, stuff like that. And it's supposed to give the company a good name or a good image, because look, Way to Happiness, right? As long as you don't connect the dots with L. Ron Hubbard's name, which I think more and more people do now. I mean, it would be a bit of a PR disaster for a company to be spreading around L. Ron Hubbard's works these days, because Scientology's name, again, is mud, as it should be. So you kind of get the idea of what this is all about. But I wanted to give you the full picture of it. So thanks for asking. There you go.